Greetings, fellow painters! Today we're going to paint a moonlit miniature in the half-chop style, and we're going to boil it down to only 2 essential paints that you'll need to quickly achieve this effect. This video will be front-loaded with all the information that you need to immediately start painting this moonlight or shadow effect. After this initial half-chop moonlight demonstration, I will proceed to demonstrate how I paint the rest of the miniature, so keep watching until the end if that interests you. Welcome to Treehane Miniatures. The first paint that we'll need is a dark blue primer, preferably a paint and primer in one. I like to use Rust-Oleum Midnight Blue in a satin finish, mostly because of its relatively low cost. The satin finish has enough bite to allow subsequent layers of paint to adhere to it, and the finish also looks nice as an exposed dark blue color for the shadows. This is important since this will not only be the base color for the entire moonlit side of the miniature, but also act as the deepest shadow color on the fully painted side of the miniature. You can get an idea of how this will work as the shadow color by looking at this primed miniature that has had some red paint applied as the base for the lit side of the model. Alternatively, if you're averse to using utilitarian products like Rust-Oleum and money is no object for you, you could use one of the dark blue colored primers from Citadel or the Army Painter. The second paint that you'll need to achieve this effect in the fastest way possible is a dark blue speed paint or contrast paint. I like using Beowulf Blue by the Army Painter, mostly because it's the only dark blue speed paint that I own. A fine alternative to using one of these speed paints is to use any dark blue standard acrylic paint thinned with water to a glaze consistency, which you'll use to apply over the white dry brush just like you would with speed paint. I've used Deep Blue by the Army Painter many times to achieve this effect. Alright, let's paint. Starting with the Midnight Blue Rattle Can Primer as a base for the moonlight, we're going to apply a light dry brush of titanium white to the shadow or moonlight side of the mini. For this dry brush, I like to use basic Liquitex titanium white paint, which has a very creamy consistency, mixed with some titanium white ink. The creamy paint adds body or thickness to the mix, and the white ink adds plenty of pigment. This will be a much lighter dry brush than your typical Slapchop style. Here, we just want to catch the raised areas and prominent features with the dry brush. We'll take this lighter approach since we aren't dry brushing over a black primer and our dark blue shadow color is already in place, meaning that the speed paint does not need to act as the midtone color, the shadow color, and the highlight color for this piece. It will just be used to tint the white dry brushed areas and act as the highlight. A very easy but completely optional step after the dry brush is to take a minute to intensify the dry brush highlights in a few areas. I'll use the same white acrylic paint and acrylic ink mix, and with a standard brush I'll paint fine highlights in the center of some of the dry brushed areas. I will focus these highlights in select places, such as a few prominent folds in the Cultist cloak and the design on the back of the cloak, which I imagine would be metallic and shiny. With the dry brushing complete, we can move on to the speed paint. We'll apply the dark blue speed paint over the entire shadow side of the mini. However, unlike the intended approach to applying speed paint, where you put it on thick and allow it to pool in the recesses, we are applying the paint in a thin coat just to tint the white dry brushing. You'll want to apply this as you would a normal thin coat of standard acrylic paint. There really isn't any harm in allowing it to pool in the recessed areas, it'll just be wasteful. That said, this really isn't a very careful process. In fact, even going a little bit into the painted side of the mini with this speed paint will help blend the transition from the light to the dark side of the miniature. And that's really all there is to half-chopping your moonlit miniature. The well-lit side of your miniature can and should be painted in your preferred painting style, whether that is Slapchop, or layering, or base shade highlight, or, well, you get the picture. Here, since I'm batch painting 10 miniatures at the same time, I've chosen to start by using an airbrush to lay the red foundation for the Cultist cloak. If you'd prefer to see this painting style without the use of an airbrush, you can check out this video here, where I accomplish the same look in a Slapchop style. For the base coat of the red cloak, I use Whole Red, which is one of my favorite foundation colors for anything from browns to reds to flesh tones. I'll mix it at a ratio of about 3 drops of thinner for every 1 drop of paint and mix it well. Before adding paint to my airbrush, I always add 2 to 3 drops of flow improver to the cup to help prevent clogging. I live in a very dry climate, so every little precaution helps. I then make sure that my compressor is set to about 22 psi or 1.5 bars. When applying this base color, I spray it at a 45-degree angle from above, and I'll focus the spray on the right side and front of the model. I do this for all 10 Cultist miniatures before moving on to the next step. It surprisingly only takes about 4.5 minutes for all 10 minis, so this really is one of the fastest ways to paint. I'll do one more pass with the airbrush, this time using Scarlet Blood Game Color. I prep the color for painting in the same way that I prepared the whole red, by thinning it 3:1 with thinner and adding a little flow improver to the airbrush cup first. This time, however, I'll spray the miniatures at a higher angle from above and more from the right side so that I don't cover up all of the previous layer of whole red. Changing to a standard brush, I'll use burnt red to base the hood, scarves, and bibs on all 10 cultists. The character art shows these as a deeper red than the rest of the cloak. With the exception of the blue backlight effect, I'm trying to stick close to the game art for these miniatures. These pieces will then get highlighted with a mix of the same burnt red with some pale yellow added. Even though I'm adding in a light yellow for the highlight color, it turned the burnt red a little more pink than expected. That's fine. I'll just cover less territory with these highlights so that the fabric still reads as red. If I overdo the highlights with this color, the clothing may appear to be pink with deep red shadows. I don't want that. I'll apply these highlights to the hood, scarf, and bib components of the miniatures. I use Pyrrole Red to brighten the bright red folds in the cloak. This color is a little more opaque and a little brighter than the Scarlet Blood Game Color that I use as the foundation. The sleeves and shoulders will receive a highlight of this color in addition to the robe. The darker left front side of the mini will get a few accents with this color, and this will be the brightest highlight that the darker front side of the miniature gets. Then we'll mix some pale yellow with the Pyrrole Red and add some minimal highlights around the shoulder apron, cloak, and sleeves. The final series of highlights for the clothing will be added with pure pale yellow. These highlights will be focused around the facial features, upward facing folds in the fabric, and some edge highlights. Pale yellow is featured as the final highlight color on every miniature in this board game to unify all the pieces so that they all look like they are interacting with the same environment. Necromancer Cloak by the Army Painter is used to darken the eye sockets and pie holes in the cultist hoods. I also use it for the little bit of sleeve that is peeking out from under the cloak, and as the only color that will be applied to the shoes. Necromancer Cloak is my favorite dark gray color, and I hope that this has been carried over to the Fanatic line of paints and that it will eventually be sold separately. German Camo Black Brown is going to make a solid foundation for all of the fleshy bits of the hand and chin area of the Preacher Cultist. I've also used this for the pages of the book. I decided to go with a dark parchment color that is fitting for the evil rituals used to summon the Great Old Ones. I'm going to do very little to alter this dark brown color of the pages other than highlight the page's edges and center binding. Tanned Flesh by the Army Painter will act as the mid-tone color for the skin. We'll cover most of the surface of the hands, lips, and chin, leaving very little of the German Camo Black Brown showing. As with the rest of the painting method, we aren't covering any of the blue paint on the back of the hands with this color. Elven Flesh by the Army Painter will act as the final highlights for the hands, lips, and chin. As an added bonus, I'm also using this color to scribble in some ritual text in all of the books. I start by sketching in some random symbol in the upper left corner of the left page. Then I make a series of marks with some light cross-hatching and stippling to simulate text. The end result looks pretty okay. I'll use pale yellow to paint the teeth on the follower cultist, and I'll use it to paint glistening highlights on the lips of the Preacher Cultist. Going back to the German Camo Black Brown, I'll paint all of the metal parts of these models. I'm speeding my way through these models, so I'm just going to do a pseudo non-metallic metal by dry brushing a few yellows and covering less area with each subsequent lighter color. The yellow paints that I'm going to use for these metal bits are Desert Yellow, Demonic Yellow, and Pale Yellow. The Desert Yellow will go on first and I'll cover all of the raised areas. The Demonic Yellow will be used to edge highlight the tops of all of those raised areas. Lastly, I'll use Pale Yellow to add some final glints of light. These glints of light will follow a single diagonal line from the upper right of the miniature, which is our left, to the lower left of each medallion. As a final touch, I will use some skeleton bone by the army painter to paint a highlight down the center interior binding of the book, and I'll also use it to add edge highlights to the pages of the book. And if you would like to see a miniature speed painted in this style without using an airbrush, be sure to check out this Slapchop version here. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.